Well, here we are. I'm ready to put in the back panel of the lining. Now I've laid out a piece of cloth and marked it according to, just laid it out on the cloth and made a chalk mark and cut it rather than take measurements with a tape and then transfer it. I've pinned it in place so that we have a decent overlap on either side. We have about a 1/4 inch seam allowance at the bottom here, and it's hanging over a little bit at the top of the kilt. Now this kilt has a rather long fell, so, and this rarely happens to me, but it's happened in this case. I think I mentioned in one of the earlier videos that this piece isn't quite wide. It's not as wide as, it's not wide enough to allow me to just drop it in place, trace the outline, and cut it. We have to do a little bit of tailoring actually. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to twitch the cloth down on either side. A little difficult to do one-handed because my videographer is busy, can't be spared. And we want about a 3/4 to 1 inch overlap, about the width of my pinky to the width of my thumb on each end. Now the cloth has a couple of wrinkles in it, but I'm not worried about that because as I'm sewing and shaping it, some of these will disappear, but a little bit of bagginess is good because the bagginess plus the hand of this cloth, again, it helps keep the shirt tucked in. So, but because of that, the one way we're going to deal with that bagginess is that when I'm sewing along the top of the kilt, I'm going to gather the cloth slightly. I think rutching I think that's the correct word for it, but I'm going to sew little gathers in the cloth, little puckers, to take up that extra bit. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to pin this all the way around, just around the edges so it doesn't shift. As you can see, I've marked with a chalk. I'm going to cut this radius because otherwise there'd be just too much cloth folded under at the top of the kilt. And then I'm going to start sewing from about here, from about the middle of the kilt. And again, sewing little gathers, little puckers to take up some of this extra cloth. And then I'm not going to cut this until I get to the corner, because sometimes I found that I'll cut it right at the beginning, and as I'm sewing the puckers, the cloth is being pulled towards the edge and I wind up with an inadequate overlap. So I'm going to sew this and I'm going to get to about 1 or 2 stitches away from the corner, and then I'll strike a chalk mark and then cut that, and then sew it most of the way down, and then strike a chalk mark to show that radius and cut it, and then sew and do it all the way to the top. So I'll stop, I'll make a couple of more videos as this proceeds, and then we'll stitch them together so you can see exactly what I'm talking about here. So, right, here we go. So here we are, part 2. I've cut that crescent away from the top of the kilt. Throw that away, and I've pinned it in place, and because I actually had 2 hands to work with, I managed to get rid of much of the bagginess, smoothing it out and pinning it and such like that. So I'm going to leave these pins and again start sewing here, I gather along here, and then around. So check in a few minutes, and I'll just keep posting little things as I proceed, but not tonight because, well, look at that, it's beer o'clock. Here we are continuing with sewing the back panel of the lining. And as you can see, as I'd mentioned before, I've started in about the middle and gathered, sewn a sort of a gathered seam. As you can see, there's a bit of pucker there to absorb some of this extra cloth that otherwise would be too baggy. And I've just come up to the corner. As I said, I've given myself about an inch overlap there. And I've just marked and cut that line, and now I'll turn this corner and sew, and you might just be able to see the chalk there very faintly. I'm using clay chalk rather than wax chalk here because I'm predicting, again, see, I'm predicting that will be the line I cut to, but I'm not going to cut it until I get about here, just in case my sewing has brought the cloth up a little bit, because hand sewing and overhand stitch like that can do that. It can cause one piece of cloth to shift relative to the other. So I've marked that again with clay chalk, allowing for like a 1/4 inch seam allowance. We'll see if that in fact translates into reality, or survives reality. So yeah, I'll get to here, I'll double check that, mark it again if necessary, cut it, carry on around, and do the same thing for the next 3 corners. And then with luck, as I sew another puckering seam, I believe that's the right terminology, you know what I mean, as we have here, to absorb that extra cloth, ideally it'll be nicely done. I mean, there'll be some bagginess because, again, I really think that helps with keeping the shirt tucked in, but it's not going to be unsightly. Will it turn out successful? That's the great part of this. I don't know. There's always a chance that it'll go wrong and I'll have to rip my seams and start again, but that's okay. That makes it interesting. So we're going to do all of this. I'll probably report in once more for this, and then cutting and sewing the buttonhole, which I believe I've described elsewhere, but I'll probably show you again. So there we go. Well, here we are. I left you as I was sewing this seam, as I recall. So as I'd said, I'd come close to a corner, strike a line with chalk, cut, and carry on. Did it all the way around. And now I'm going to cut the buttonhole. So sometimes I can just do this with a bit of chalk, but in this case, this occasion, I've put a couple of flower-headed pins through to mark the locations of the bar tack above and below. So we see where they come through on this side. Now, often I can just feel the things, but I was feeling I'll just spend that little bit extra caution and run the pins through to show. So I mark, and I think I've already talked about this if you find one of my videos on making the buttonhole. So I've marked either side, and then I've given it a bit of a rub, and you can see that's shown me the line of the overlap. And now I'll cut this, put a couple of V's on either end, and then just tuck it under and sew around. This is so hard to do when there's only one of me. So there, I've made the cut, as I said, a couple of V's connected, and then folded the edges under. And I'll just sew this down with a very fine stitch, and Bob's your uncle. And this is funny, because when I make this cut, my heart is absolutely in my mouth every time I make it, because if I goof this up, I have to tear the whole thing out and start over. But once again, I seem to have done it well. So I'll stitch this down, and that is the lining complete. And I'll do another couple of videos where the fit of the back panel was different, because again, this one was a little bit problematic because of the cloth wasn't big enough to just throw over the arc and then trace and cut out. So, but there we are. Here we are with the lining all done. The little bit of fullness in the cloth, but again, that's to our advantage because I really believe it really helps keeping the shirt tucked in. The raw edges of the canvas and the lining are protected by that hidden running stitch. Because this piece, I had to arc this piece to make it fit rather than a series of folds or seams, no matter how neatly they're done. I prefer to do a top seam that's a little bit puckered to absorb some of that extra cloth, and then a flat seam around the other 3, and then a flat seam around the buttonhole. And there we are. Now again, had the customer been able to come by for a final fitting, which is still the preferred way, then I would have left this seam open from about here around the corner so that I could precisely locate the strap in his presence, but such was not to be. So there we go. Again, I'll post a few more of these things as I do different linings, just if there's anything else new and remarkable to mention and to add to the subject. So there we go.